Imagine doing 4 tours of Afghanistan as part of the SAS, on the front line, fighting an enemy who doesn't follow any of the rules of warfare, whose evil knows no bounds. Then imagine if it was also your job to try and save the lives of your mates, the soldiers you fought alongside, who became like family. This was Dan Pronk's life, and some of what he saw and experienced still haunt him to this day. So how do you continue to function? How do you come home to your family and try and live a normal life again? How do you survive? I wanted to ask him. Dan, so grateful to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us here on air, and congratulations on the new book. It's incredible, quite cathartic, I'd say, for you to write.
Look, it was, Erin, and thank you for having me on the show. You're absolutely correct. The writing process was hugely cathartic and was a significant part in me processing all the events that had happened and moving forward in a meaningful fashion.
Can you take me through what happens in the field of war when someone goes down, when someone gets injured? Do you get a phone call? Are you there with the team on the ground? What happens?
So generally, I'd be there with the team on the ground, and the first priority in that situation is to control the tactical situation, to try and control the threat. You really can't provide any meaningful medical care to someone in the field unless that threat's under control. So the tactical piece comes first. From there, once you could render the scene as safe as it could be or get that casualty to an area of relative safety, then the main priority was trying to control massive hemorrhage, massive bleeding. That's the number one killer cause of preventable death on the battlefield. And so things like arterial tourniquets to cut off the blood flow to limbs and stop bleeding, packing wounds with a new generation of dressings that can help stop bleeding, and then moving on to securing the casualty's airway, making sure their breathing is under control, decompressing chests if there's penetrating chest wounds and pressures building up, or plugging holes in chests that are stopping the breathing, and moving on from there. There's a very deliberate sequence that we follow, and then it's about trying to get them out of the field, so getting a medical evacuation and getting them to a surgical facility most often where they'd get their ongoing care.
I can't even imagine how a doctor does that in an operating theatre, in a hospital, safely here in Australia. How do you do that in that environment? How do you control your own emotions, your own panic, your own fear?
It's a good question, and certainly there was a lot of training invested in all of us. There was thousands of hours of training invested in me by some, selfless mentors of mine. So before you even set foot in that environment, you've gone over this so many times in really high fidelity, reality-based training to program you almost with muscle memory to be able to respond to these situations, and a huge amount of stress inoculation. So this desensitization through high fidelity training, so that by the time you find yourself in an environment like a combat scenario, treating casualties, it's not terribly shocking. It's the training was such that we were prepared well for that.
You would have saved the lives of so many people, but I know that the lives of those you couldn't save are the ones that would replay over and over. And a friend, you had to watch a friend look into his eyes as he passed away. How do you cope with that? Do you cope?
Look, it's a good question, and I don't know that there's a good answer for it. It's at the time, it's remarkably, and it sounds callous, but remarkably easy to keep functioning at the time, because when those scenarios were playing out, there was an ongoing tactical situation, there was an ongoing mission, a distraction from what had just happened, and so it was easy to move on and stay focused and stay occupied and distracted. And indeed, I found when I was on operations, the ongoing tempo of our missions provided a great distraction. It was constantly fast-paced, moving forward, and you didn't have the time to really reflect and process these events. And so, but of course, none of that really went away. So while I didn't deal with it at the time, I stayed distracted and stayed active and engaged. It eventually caught up with me when my pace of life slowed and when I got out of the military. And that was when these things sort of caught up with me, and I realised I had some work to do to make sense of them.
Yeah, I want to get to the moment that you come home to your family and try and live a normal life in just a second. But for those of us who could never imagine what it's like to be in Afghanistan, to watch people die, what does a person go through who's just given their life for our country?
Look, I mean, it varied. Generally, the response, it was quite traumatic injuries that they'd sustained on the field of battle, and it varied person to person. But look, I think this isn't unique to soldiers. It certainly isn't unique to me. This is something that our police officers, our ambulance officers, our correctional officers, emergency department staff are all facing on a day-to-day basis. They're responding to these critical incidents, and they're having these significant events, these very traumatic events, and just like us, there's still a job to do, and they have to get on with it, and they have to keep moving and keep going, and that distraction is very useful at the time, but these are all organisations and individuals that once again need to process that, and I think across the board with first responders, this is an issue and something that I think it's great to try and raise awareness of and be supportive of not just our veteran community, but our first responders across the board.
No, it's a really good point you make. You come home to your wife, to your kids. What happens then?
That was probably the hardest part, and maybe a hurdle that I didn't see coming when I discharged from the military particularly. So I had gotten out, I'd been in the special operations environment for 5 years, and all I'd seen was the positives of getting out. It'd be lower stress, I'd be home with my family more. As a doctor, my career prospects were good as a civilian, and so I saw all these positives. And what I found happened was when I got out, I was worse off than ever from a mental health perspective. All of a sudden, I started to get highly anxious and agitated and angry, and was having flashbacks, bad dreams, all these symptoms that I knew as a doctor were post-traumatic stress. And it just seemed really odd. It seemed paradoxical that they were happening when I was never safer. I was home with my family more than ever, earning more money. And that really got me interested in what was so protective about being in that military environment, what was so protective against all that stress, and what had I lost when I transitioned out. But so, yeah, it was a really challenging, tough time, and God bless Christy, my wife. She's a very stoic woman, and she was really the cornerstone for me getting through that period.
You're a doctor. People come to you for help. Was it difficult for you to go to someone for help yourself?
Yeah, look, it was. It really was. And I think as medical professionals, this is something we don't do well. I think I felt that because I knew the theory and I knew I could diagnose what was happening, that somehow I should be immune to it, or as a human, I shouldn't be as vulnerable as a non-medical person to what was happening. So, yeah, it was a real challenge. It was, I think, embarrassingly as a male, I think generally we're worse at seeking help or just discussing our feelings. I think that was compounded by being a part of a sort of construct like the Army Special Operations. It was all these compounding factors that I don't think I tapped into the resources that could have helped me at that time as well as I might have.
Resilience, it means something different to everyone, I think, dependent on your own experiences. How did you build yours?
Yeah, this was the thing that kicked off my deep interest in resilience, was this transition out of defence and then looking at what were these factors that were bolstering all of us when we were in the Army, when we were on operations in places like Afghanistan. What had I lost when I got out? And that was this resilience piece. It was this armour, if you like. And there was a huge sense of identity loss. There was a huge loss of purpose when I got out, and this loss of tribe, these people that I'd had all these really rich experiences, both positive and negative, with, that were like a family to me that I'd lost. And so I started to look into resilience, looking into the scientific literature of what it was, what my experience was, looking at the experience of other discharging veterans and other great case studies. and started to come up with this model of resilience, started to sort of dissect it, because I looked at this and I thought, well, I used to be resilient. I've lost all this sort of resilience when I got out of the military, and if I can work out at a granular level what I can do to rebuild it, then I can build myself back into a resilient person again. So that was this interest, and started to team up with my brother, another guy called Tim Curtis, who's another two ex-SAS veterans, and under a project called the Resilient Shield, started doing some research in partnership with University of Western Australia, and have ended up developing this validated model of resilience. So we've worked out a model by which we can be proactively building resilience on a day-to-day basis.
Oh, that's absolutely brilliant, and we can all benefit from doing that regardless of what walk of life we come from. So Dr. Dan Pronk, thank you so very much. It's an incredible book. You gave credit to your wife. I'm sure she gives credit back to you and your kids as well. Happy Father's Day. They're very lucky to have you, as are we as a nation. Thank you for your service, and thank you for this incredible book.